What we have here is a rather shocking revelation, the result of a Freedom of Information Act request filed by Children's Health Defense with the CDC. What we have here, I believe, if I'm seeing it correctly, is a document from the CDC in which they discuss in early 2021 how they are going to analyze evidence of adverse events in order to discover whether or not the new COVID-19 vaccines are creating health problems that are worthy of some sort of regulatory change. And what they describe is a regime, I believe it is section 2.3 of this document. They outline a mechanism, I would argue, and our good friend Matthew Crawford has also argued that it is a very flawed mechanism for analyzing the data in the VAERS system. But what they advocate is a system, the acronym is PRR, and effectively it involves looking at the ratio of different adverse events between vaccines. So you take a new vaccine like the COVID vaccine, the COVID mRNA vaccine, and you compare it to a long-standing vaccine, and you see whether the ratio of adverse events that are reported differs from the prior vaccine. And if it does differ, that might suggest, if there's an elevated level of one particular kind of adverse event, it might suggest that something is amiss.
Let me just quote from that document that Zach just had up, the relevant portion, which you've just done a very good job of summarizing, but let's just have it in the CDC's words. This is from the briefing document posted on the CDC website in January 2021, updated in February 2022 with minor changes. Section 2.3.1, Proportional Reporting Ratio, PRR. CDC will perform PRR data mining on a weekly basis or as needed. PRRs compare the proportion of a specific AE, that is, adverse event, following a specific vaccine versus the proportion of the same AE following receipt of another vaccine. A safety signal is defined as a PRR of at least 2, chi-squared statistic of at least 4, and 3 or more cases of the AE following receipt of the specific vaccine of interest. I sped up because none of the particulars matters here. It's the first sentence. CDC will perform PRR data mining on a weekly basis or as needed. And then the final little paragraph here. CDC will apply appropriate comparative vaccines, e.g. adjuvanted vaccines like Shingrix and or Fluad for adjuvanted COVID-19 vaccines, and adjust for severity and age distributions where applicable. And the first punchline here, which I have in front of me, I don't know, maybe you want to do it or I can just
go for it.
Arrive at it, is that I'm reading right now from a piece written by Josh Gutskow, PhD, on the Defender blog on Children's Health Defense, who says, I was concerned about what we're going to find with adverse events, but at least the CDC said repeatedly we're going to be doing this PRR. These, by which we could tell, and there are problems itself with PRR as a mechanism to tell
for
safety.
example, if you have 2 vaccines that have a high rate of adverse events but the same ratio of harms, it will be not detectable by this method, right? So if a particular adjuvant, for example, created a given ratio of harms, and the ratio was therefore the same between 2 different vaccines that use that same adjuvant, you wouldn't see it by this mechanism. So the mechanism leaves many routes by which it would fail to detect adverse events that matter. But it turns out that's not even the problem here.
Right.
The problem here is worse than that.
We got a dog on the move, sorry guys.
A dog trapped by equipment.
Yeah, so there are more obvious and better ways to assess whether or not you've got an adverse event associated with a vaccine. The advantage of PRR, apparently, is that it's simple. There's a rubric already in process. It takes basically a push of a button. It really takes almost nothing to do it. And what I just read from the document that was first put up by the CDC in January 21 and updated with minor changes in February 22 said, quote, CDC will perform PRR data mining on a weekly basis or as needed. And yet, when the Children's Health Defense put in a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, to see the results of the PRR, again, the analysis the CDC has said it would be doing on the mRNA COVID vaccines, the agency wrote, quote, "No PRRs were conducted by CDC. Furthermore, data mining is outside of the agency's purview." The agency then suggests contacting the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which was supposed to perform a different type of data mining.
So this is jaw-dropping. Yeah. I mean, it can't really be a shock to any of us who've been paying attention to the absolutely unprecedented adverse event signal in the VAERS system and have been saying, all right, we are told that this system, which was set up to detect adverse events, is not reliable. But then if that's true, if they're not paying attention to this system, are they paying attention to no system? Because it would certainly seem that you would need to have something monitoring adverse events in order to know whether these highly novel vaccines were doing some new major kind of damage. What we have in this case is we've got the CDC telling us exactly what analysis they were going to perform. When we in the public perform that analysis, we get a very alarming answer for these vaccines. And then when a Freedom of Information Act request is directed at the CDC, who has told us that they intended to perform these analyses, the result is they tell us, well, they didn't do it, which means that apparently the CDC was not addressing the question of the unprecedented adverse event signal from these vaccines and was simply proceeding as if it didn't exist. This is...
Well, going into public with the talking heads, the people who may have the right credentials but don't seem to know anything about how to do science or what it would mean to do so, making claims like, on April 27th, 2021, CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky stating that the CDC does not see any signals relating to heart inflammation. Well, on what basis can that claim be made if they're doing no analysis at all?
Right. I mean, you know, did she look in the couch cushions for...
I see no heart inflammation.
Right. There's no evidence of heart inflammation in these couch cushions, right? So the point is, okay, you've got people who are charged with protecting us from adverse events. You've got a system that was set up, which frankly is set up in such a way that it is very difficult even for damaging vaccines to trigger enough of a signal to get anyone's attention. And in this case, you have an outscaled signal which does show up in this system. It does not appear to be anomalous to the extent it's been looked at. Who filed these reports? It's overwhelmingly medical professionals and people involved in pharmaceutical production themselves who have filed these reports. It is a match for what we see in the British yellow card system. There's all kinds of evidence that suggests that there's a very serious adverse event problem. And those who are charged with balancing the risks of a vaccine with the benefits of that vaccine are apparently blinding themselves to the very signal that they would need to analyze in order to decide whether or not the cost was worth enduring in order to get the benefit. And, you know, go ahead.
Well, an image just came to my mind. You know, we hear terms that are used somewhat metaphorically like rudderless. The system seems rudderless. Perhaps it's leaderless, where there's just a figurehead there. And I think rudderless is wrong. I feel like to the extent that a boat with a rudder metaphor is apt here, there is a rudder and there's someone in charge and they've been told just crank it all the way one way, no matter what. The rudder's intact and we are just going to steer the ship that way, that way, that way, always the same way. And it's not random. Right? The bad information and bad public health policy and just bad all the way down almost with regard to responses to COVID at the public policy and public health level have been not chaotic. They have been not random. They have been not arbitrary. They always err in the same directions. And that is what suggests that we are not rudderless and we are not leaderless, but we are definitely being driven.
We are being driven, and we are being driven in a way that puts us in peril. In other words, when they said safe and effective, those were effectively going to be the conclusions irrespective of what the evidence suggested, right? Yeah. Here we now find out what safe means, which is it means that they wrote that into the brochure. That was, at best, their hope of what would be true. And then they steadfastly avoided the evidence that would tell them if they had been incorrect about it. Right?
Safe as far as we could tell before we had any data, and then we stopped checking.
Yeah, it's unconscionable.
If even, like that even may be a generous interpretation from what we are now seeing about early results out of the Pfizer trials.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing, and the reason that this connects to the prior two topics, is that we are in a polarized environment where those of us who have attempted to divine what is actually true about the costs and benefits of these vaccines, about the hazards of this disease, about the way in which you might risk stratify people and protect many people who don't need the vaccines because they're protected by virtue of being young and healthy, right? We have been demonized.
Yeah.
We have been demonized on the basis that we misunderstood the evidence, when in fact what we are now finding out is that there was an effort not to see the evidence. That, of course, it should shock no one that demonizing us was part of preventing that evidence from being scrutinized by anyone. And the question is, what do we now do about it? If this is what the CDC does, then what even is it?
What even is it? What even is it? From which agencies and on what basis were legions, really almost all of the doctors, being given their marching orders, which then even normally free-thinking, often heterodox, very qualified to think scientifically, scientists and researchers themselves said, wow, this is a complex landscape. I'm going to listen to my doctor. Well, if the doctors themselves have been given information that was incomplete, that was dogmatic, that would not change in the face of evidence, then those scientists who are trusting their doctors are not acting scientifically. They're acting as if the authorities would not lie to them and could not be wrong. And so that is where we find ourselves now. That those few of us, who are many more than mainstream media would have you believe, but those few of us who stuck our necks out and said publicly over and over and over again, actually, this doesn't add up. These policies don't seem to be a match for what we can see. And science doesn't work that way. And there's no way that consensus could have been arrived at so quickly and have it be a legitimate scientific consensus. Those of us who did that and were thrown under the bus and demonetized and told that we were killing people and all of this, as more and more evidence suggests that actually the analysis either hasn't been being done, or when it is being done, it suggests exactly the things that those of us who've been warning about it were correct. What now? Like, fast forward in 5 years, the next one of these happens. Where are the people who are actually doing the science and can understand the science well enough to communicate it to people who are going to be making public policies? Because if it's the same people with the same systems in place, we are in exactly as much trouble as we were before, and even more actually, because now it's really clear what proportion of the population is willing to say, okay, whatever you say, I'll accept your thing. I trust you.
Well, there's that for the next pandemic. There's also the question, what I don't yet hear is a mutiny. Right? The doctors who were effectively dragged into gaslighting people who were injured on the pretense that adverse events were actually very rare, and therefore most of the people who walked through the doors of their doctor's office and said, I'm suffering from this vaccine, were effectively turned away, told that it was a coincidence, told that it was in their heads, right? Where are the doctors who should be rising up and demanding that the CDC be replaced by an actual CDC, right? That absence, who knows? This is a new result, but I am not really expecting to see the doctors stand up, because the doctors have been dragged into something unholy.
Yep.
And, the question is which thing will now drive them? Will they be driven by the Hippocratic Oath and the fact that they have been forced or induced to violate it by a CDC that was only pretending to be interested in adverse events? will they be driven by their conscience now, or will they be driven by covering their asses and not admitting to all of the patients that they turned away and shouldn't have, that in fact they screwed up and there are adverse events, there are lots of them, and these people need to be treated. We need to have, effectively a rapid bootstrapping of the medicine of treating the adverse events that come from these highly novel vaccines. So I guess time will tell. But I'm concerned that everybody has gotten so used to parroting the official narrative that this is, even though it is obviously jaw-dropping that the CDC apparently violated its own plan for monitoring adverse events and didn't monitor them at all, I'm concerned that that will be treated as just another minor anomaly here, when in fact it is an indication of exactly what's gone wrong.